So welcome, we have some people joining us and welcome to the second session of the Net Zero Scotland Community Future Series. And where we're focusing today is a panel conversation on whose responsibility is it for us to get to net zero. But before we do that, I would just like to introduce you all to my granny. You are going to be seeing a lot of my granny over the course of the 2 weeks, and I will reveal exactly why you'll be seeing a lot of my granny in a different conversation at some point. But first, just sit back and enjoy the next 3 minutes or 4 minutes.
There's always to see something in nature that astounds you. Always. On some occasions, my husband and myself, we got up 5 o'clock and went down to the seaside, and it was absolutely heaven. There was such a peaceful air about it, and all you could see now and again, a seal climbing onto one of these wee islands. So that was always quite good. Early in the morning, there's such a peacefulness in the air. You know, you don't get through the day. I don't know, we haven't seen any seagulls here. There was a time, every morning at a certain time, you heard one seagull, sea thing, quawking about, you know, early in the morning. At first, when I saw the really high mountains, I wondered what that was. And then it dawned on me, I thought, oh my God, these are the mountains. I don't know, I was quite in awe of it, especially when the sun has been shining all day and there's a glow in the mountains. The whole mountain lights up. I was quite smitten with that when I saw it first. The same, the sea can light up. I remember there was a really, really hot day, and the sea had taken a glow. All the waves that came in, they were all lit up. That was quite a sight to see. Yeah. Well, I grew up with nature. We had quite a few fields, and as children we had to walk there, you know. Sometimes, you know, once I said to my mother, much to my greatest regret afterwards, other children have holidays to play in. We have holidays to walk in. But when I look back, I always enjoyed it. Yeah, I always enjoyed it. And I can still remember crabbling about on the earth, and we had really good soil. You could get your arm right into it and felt the cool earth going over your arm, you know. So, as I say, I'm a peasant by nature. Getting things to grow and walking the earth. Yeah, you know, it's very peaceful and very therapeutic. As I say, if you open your eyes, there's always something interesting to see in nature.
Right, Granny. I'll see you in a bit.
Yeah.
With a wee reminder there from my granny, we're going to move into a conversation on whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero. First, like to start, and I want to make one thing clear, we're not really big on introductions in here. And one of the reasons being that this is an inclusive community. And when we spend too much time focusing on introductions, we can be setting ourselves up with power dynamics when really we're all about inclusivity here and recognizing that everybody is equal. So that's just a little steer for the panelists there on how much and how little you want to introduce yourself. But I'm going to hand it over to Danny to kick us off. So you've got 5 minutes to share on whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero?
Thanks, Tabitha. Well, I'll give a super brief introduction just for a context, really, so you can kind of understand where my perspectives are coming from. So I describe myself as a facilitator and an activist and someone who's worked in the community sector for most of my life. So I would say that for me, this is a huge passion, and I kind of feel it quite, viscerally in my body, and occupies a lot of my thinking, and certainly dictates a lot of my action. So yeah, I think passion sort of runs highly when it comes to these conversations. And I think it's a really interesting question. Whose responsibility is it? And for me, I just really needed to break that down, So one of the backgrounds I hold is a social sculpture background, and that really sort of lives into the small details of life, including the words that we use. And responsibility came up a lot when I was studying, and started to look at it in two parts. There's a response and ability. So how do we respond? Who can respond? And how much ability do we have to be able to respond? And so if you look at this question through that lens, then I think what it does is it sort of leads to another question, which is, well, where does the power lie? Because that really influences, how we can respond and who is actually able to respond. So first of all, to kind of give a general overview, I do think the responsibility lies with us all. Anybody who is aware, anybody who has an understanding of what's going on in the world right now, I feel, needs to move in some way towards meeting the challenge of our times. But within that context, there are certainly, there's a huge spectrum of responsibility, as I framed it. And you could point the finger at government and say, they hold the most power, the most responsibility. They have resources at their fingertips. They can control the law, and they can control, the state apparatus in order to uphold or enact the law when it comes to taxes, when it comes to funding, when it comes to, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. But government would have no power without us as citizens, without us as individuals, without us as communities, and also as businesses and organizations that are working to create change, whatever that is, providing a service, whether it's creating something for sale and distribution, or whether it's, more in the sort of charity sector, or, the social sector, whether it's about kind of policy and influence. So I really feel that when we're talking about getting, us to net zero, we need to consider who the us is as well. And we could be looking at it on a small scale, on a micro scale. What's within our sphere of influence? What's within my sphere of influence as an individual? Now, in the past, I've worked in an organisation that created one of the UK's largest grassroots community hubs. And within that, there was 500 artists, small businesses, charities. And so as our organisation stood with a small turnover, sort of 600, 700,000 pounds, we didn't have too much influence in, our surplus and what we could do there. But our influence was quite great and strong within our community. So we were able to create quite a lot of change by the dynamics and the conversations and the relationships that we had. And we focused on our community because that was what was in our remit and our sphere of influence. But, sitting, in the UK, and with the influence that we have, and with, the power that we have from our colonial heritage and from our standing and, economically in the world right now, we actually felt that we had a greater sphere of influence than just what was going on in our city. So we tried to make links with other organizations internationally that were doing the same sort of things, and to share our knowledge and to learn from others, and to see how we could really go about bringing about change. And when we focus that in on net zero, I think that we can go a long way to kind of, establishing what our sphere of influence is and making the changes we need as individuals, as organizations, and as communities, if we can create these spaces like this, where we can get together, make the connections, and hold those kind of conversations. But to sort of finish, I would say that I think it's also really important to remember that net zero itself, it's a term that has so much use. If we look at, the ScotRail hoardings, the kind of billboards that are up everywhere when you come into Glasgow and Edinburgh at the moment, you think, oh, this is great, these, national institutions doing so much. But net zero really is, it's just it's the overall, it's the net. And actually, the way in which we get there has so much influence on the quality of that target itself. And overall, we need to be looking beyond net zero. We need to be creating restorative actions, restorative organizations and companies, and looking at the other actions and other things that take place along that journey as well, and not considering solely carbon in this story. The story is much bigger than that. So while it's a really useful soundbite, and it's a really useful thing to kind of visualize and have as a way of kind of directing action, we also need to be looking at the bigger story at all as well. Otherwise, we can really shoot ourselves in the foot even more than we're doing already.
Thank you so much there, Danny. And just, that wider net is something that what we're doing very much here throughout the conversation programme is casting that wider net, with the anchor being net zero for these conversations. Juliet, if I can call on you to come next and answer the question, whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero?
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll give a bit of a background as well. I just studied international environmental law as a master's degree. And so I've always believed from the age, well, I was around 15, that we would actually be able to resolve climate change through law, that we'd be able to implement standards, for organizations around the world, but also for governments through the power of international law. However, having now studied it, I know that it does have its limits. So when I first heard the question, whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero, my first instinct was to think the big fossil fuel companies, obviously, since we know that over 20 fossil fuel companies have been responsible for over a third of all greenhouse gas emissions over the past 20 years. So the first instinct is obviously to target them because they're the ones that are responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions. However, when we look at it with a legal perspective, it's actually quite hard to be able to corner them and be able to actually make them pay for the consequences over the past few decades. I can give a quick example. There was a case involving Chevron back in 2012. So there was over 3,000 indigenous groups that got together and were brought together by this one lawyer in the US. His name is Stephen Donziger. It's a very important name. And so he brought all of these indigenous peoples together in order to be able to bring a bit of responsibility to Chevron, specifically for polluting the Amazon. So over a decade. So this was from 1978 to 1988. So this was before Chevron was actually formed, but Chevron bought Texaco, which was responsible for that pollution. So the court in Ecuador found that Chevron was guilty and that they had to pay $9.6 billion in order to compensate for the cost of the pollution of the area of all these indigenous peoples. However, this court finding was back in 2012. They still haven't paid it. And also on top of that, the lawyer who was involved in this case, so Stephen Donziger, was actually brought to court in the US by Chevron. And he was found guilty of corruption or colluding with the local government back in Ecuador, which is actually not based on any facts. He was actually held under home detention for over 800 days and is currently in prison serving a sentence of over a year. So not only does Chevron not have to pay the $9.6 billion for polluting the area in the Amazon, on top of that, the lawyer who actually did this for free, pro bono, back in 2012, is currently in prison for trying to correct the wrong of the past. So I no longer believe that the law is probably the way, but I completely agree with what Danny was saying earlier. I think that it is a shared responsibility. I believe that the term responsibility is often confused with the term blame, and we have a tendency of blaming specific groups, as I've just done with the fossil fuel companies. And as a consequence, we believe that we no longer have any responsibility with climate change since we target specific groups and we, as a consequence, don't do anything anymore. And so I believe that this is not also individual responsibility, although it can be argued that there is individual responsibility with climate change. I do believe that responsibility is shared as a community. It is shared in society. And I believe that the only way out of climate change with regards to also aiming towards net zero is shared. And yeah, those are my thoughts on whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero.
Thank you very much for those, Juliet. A lot of great facts, and I appreciate the lawyer attention to detail there of bringing the facts into the conversation, showing off the skills that you've got there. Let's move on to Phil.
Hi,
Whose
good morning.
responsibility is it to get us to net zero?
What a big question. Morning, everyone. By way of introduction, my experience is that I was a politician and was lucky enough to be the UK Minister of State for Environment and Climate Change, and was the UK rep at COP13 back in the day in Bali. I mean, Danny's set the scene for us. It's everybody's responsibility. I think morally, I do think that the industrialized nations have more of a responsibility. We have been producing greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. So we do bear more of a responsibility, and what's particularly difficult to square, I think, is that we've known that we've been damaging the climate for many years now. Perhaps it's fair to say that back in Victorian times they didn't realize, but we've known for decades. I think secondly, Jane, I think older people have a responsibility to younger people. I like what Juliet said, it's not about blame, but if you say, you know, we're all responsible, are we all responsible equally? Clearly the people and the organizations with a bigger carbon footprint have got more responsibility. So I would say, if I was dishing out blame, to use that word, I think we in the Western countries really are to blame, particularly because, you know, what is it now, 50 years, 40 odd 50 years since we realized the full extent of what we were doing. And yet now we're still trying to plan sufficiently how to prevent the damage. So I do think the responsibility is not shared evenly. That's my two pennyworth on the question. Don't know if it answers it.
Well, thank you so much for that, Phil. I always find it interesting whenever my cats decide to join conversations when we're on Zoom, because it doesn't happen all the time, but you'll be pleased to know that the cat has decided to join the conversation and is purring, I would say, in approval of the conversation so far. So as we move on, Nina, how would you answer the question, whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero?
So yeah, first of all, I'm Nina. My backgrounds are in international business administration and carbon management. And I'm currently volunteering for the Scottish Net Zero community. Otherwise, I think you don't need any more background necessarily. So yeah, I'm already going to apologize that I will pick up some points that were already made, because I think I agree with lots of the points that were already made. And I'm happy that the cat is joining too. Yeah, I do think, I do agree absolutely with everyone who said that there is a shared responsibility. the responsibility is shared and it is shared between everyone, but it is not equally shared. Of course, it's also not possible to equally share it, as the responsibility doesn't only fall back on individuals or only on communities, but it's like individuals, communities, organizations and corporations, but also governments. And yeah, I feel like everyone just has a different role to play. So of course there are different tasks and responsibilities or calls to action or just spreading the word. Whatever it is, everyone has their different thing to do. So it's really hard to compare responsibility and like the weight of responsibilities, as of course like people in different positions of power also have different possibility of reaching more people or fewer people, but still every bit counts and works, and everyone does have their responsibility. What therefore is the wrong approach is to just wait for one entity to do it all. Example, governments. We can't really wait for governments to fix it all for us and figure it out for us, because we've seen that that's not really happening. Like I feel like lots of people have been waiting on that, but yeah, it just hasn't been happening. So it is important to, as individuals, as companies, SMEs, communities, to actually step up and take responsibility for things. So I also have to say I find it very, very important to not let governments or like big corporations off the hook, because I think they really shouldn't be let off the hook that easily, just because everyone's saying like, well, you're not gonna do it, we're gonna do it ourselves. I feel like everyone should take their part, and we should keep trying to get governments and corporations to do their part too. Yeah, it is therefore also like, as we heard from the legal case that Juliet talked about earlier, it is important to hold people accountable, but yeah, it doesn't always work the way we want it to. So yeah, honestly, like we just spend so much time pointing fingers at people and blaming people for what's wrong. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be, like people should be held accountable for whatever they are accountable for, but we also need to listen more. We need to listen what people have to say, and we have to honestly say what we mean, and not like put up with like greenwashing like measures. Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, it is important to listen to others and then like actually be proactive and like actually take action and do those things that are important, that every individual can take part in and that they can do. So yeah, it shouldn't always just be the battle about who's responsible. Like I feel like while it's a question that's important, it's not the only thing that counts. It's more important to work together, let everyone speak, like all sectors, and listen and create proper action.
Thank you there, Nina. And just as you were talking there, there's a question from Irene that says, how about the responsibilities being tied to those who can make the biggest difference versus the biggest contributors? Just something to think about as we move last but not least to James. Whose responsibility is it to get us to net zero? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I guess just by way of introduction, James Napier, I'm one of the co-founders of the Scottish Net Zero community. I think I would echo the sentiment that it's all our responsibilities. I kind of look at lowest common denominators, and the lowest common denominator here is what we consume as individuals. You know, you can look at BP or ExxonMobil, but they're producing products that we ultimately consume. And I think that the most important thing is to look at the future. You know, certainly in global north, we've got rich economically off the back of oil and gas, so it's wrong to demonize that. For me, arguing whose fault it was in the past won't get us where we need to be. It's how do you engage people in the future. And I think that there are some key parts of human nature that are struggling to get us to that mass adoption of responsibility. And the first one is intrinsically human beings are self-focused. So the first thing we look at is how does something affect me? Then we look at how does it affect the people around us. Then we look at how does it affect us as a nation. And you still look at all of the messaging that comes out of COP26, and all the countries want to make a contribution, but ultimately they want to be a winner at the end. And whilst you've got that overriding thing that says, yeah, we want to get to net zero, but we want to come out stronger than other people or other countries at the end of it. To look at governments are fundamentally just other people in a structure. And I'm sure Phil would say that if you're in power, you've always got one eye on how popular are you and will you get re-elected. So some of the things that you can do are reliant on what the individual, the voting public will accept you doing to them. You know, you have an announcement from our government here, and the first thing the Daily Mail, the balanced voice of Middle England, does is put a big headline about how average families will be £500 a year worse off. And then when you delve into the detail, actually they won't be worse off at all, because by the time the costs come in, the income will have risen over time. So it's all our responsibility. It's how you engage people to, you know, make their own contribution. And for me, we all need to make the same contribution. You know, some of us just have a bigger percentage of, or a bigger tonnage of carbon to address, but all of us have to get to net zero. And I think if we all start to say the people who emit more need to do more first, it's this human nature concept of equity. Is it fair? And ultimately, you then are in danger of getting to the point of arguing about who's the last one to die. So, and I think it's overcoming those things about human nature that say, I'm going to start, I'm going to make the contribution I can, and I'm going to encourage and support others rather than judging others for not doing. And I think there are certain things that governments can do. And sometimes we need protecting from ourselves. I was having this conversation with somebody last week. I've got 3 children ranging from 11 to 19. None of the 3 of them have ever experienced going into a public building where somebody's smoking. So to them, that just doesn't happen. And I think, you know, we can see that was a legislation that came in that's really helped change the way that people just see social norms. And I think over time, legislation can help support that change. We all know people who were smokers, who said, I'll never go to the pub again. And then a week later, they were back in the pub having a pint and huddled outside in the bus shelter when it's raining, having a quick drag. So it's one of those things that can support, but ultimately we as individuals have to be willing to be, if you like, one step ahead and actually accepting the need to go through that curve rather than judging and saying, we'll wait till, if Labour are in, we'll wait till the Conservatives come in because they might have policies that we like better. And I think it's that personal acceptance of saying, yes, there is a transition and we have to go through that curve, but ultimately the long-term benefits are better for all of us.
Thank you very much, James. And just as you finished there, both cats came rushing back into the room as if to say, yay, you've done. So what I'd like to open it up is, I mean, there's a collective theme of collective responsibility, individual responsibility, recognizing that we've all got a role to play. For the next 10 minutes, we've got a group discussion from the panelists. If there's anything that you've heard that you'd like to respond to, agree or disagree, obviously respectfully, the opportunity is there. And I'd just like you to raise your hands, unmute yourself and join and comment. Is that you going first, Phil?
I'm happy to, yes. Fascinating points there. The UK Climate Change Act in 2008 was a deliberate attempt to set a cap and to provide the sort of leadership that James mentioned. Interestingly, as well as influencing public opinion in the United Kingdom, I think it influenced political opinion around the world. and led to other countries adopting similar measures. So I'm really interested in what you're saying there, James, because I think sometimes people do think that governments can just legislate and it all happens, you know, as if you could legislate against bad things and bad things won't happen. Well, we have legislation and people break the law. It's also, I think, this point about responsibility and the question from Irene, shouldn't the people who have the biggest carbon footprint take most responsibility? Well, they should, but that has got to square the circle with James's other point, which is that, you know, we can blame BP and Chevron, but, you know, I've just filled my car up this morning. It's a hybrid electric and I'm proud of it, but I've just filled it up with carbon fuel, haven't I? My worry is that we have to see the shift to net zero as being exactly that, that we talk about electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are no good if we're still burning carbon to make the electricity that powers the batteries. So that industrial revolution that we need, I think the government's responsibility is to regulate, yes, in a way that takes people with us and provides leadership, but it has to drill down into most aspects of our lives in order to be effective. So I think I'd probably put a bit more responsibility on the governments than perhaps some of the other comments.
Thank you, Phil. We're going to go to Danny and then Juliet will come to you afterwards, okay?
Thanks, Tabitha. Yeah, just to sort of follow on a little bit, I'll start with where you left off, Phil, in terms of the kind of question there about, you know, these big multinational organizations, and in response to sort of Irene's question, you know, the biggest difference versus the biggest contributors. You know, I do actually feel that, you know, those that were the biggest contributors, by virtue of where they sit now economically and with political influence internationally, you know, they also hold the ability to make the biggest difference. What we've seen a sort of massive block on is systemic change. You're talking about filling, you know, your car up and making those individual decisions. Well, those organizations knew a very long time ago what was needed and withheld that. And, you know, we are missing those kind of massive investments and those kind of big visions that you're talking about. There's that leadership from government, both in terms of law, whether it's bringing in things like law of ecocide, or whether it's kind of more policy related decisions around what they're going to kind of implement or introduce in terms of infrastructure. Thinking about the tidal barrage in Swansea Bay, which was, you know, a block was put on that by government, wasn't going to be funded. So we do need these sort of big decisions taken by government, but we also need corporations to start that change, and they won't do so as long as, you know, the kind of profit is their kind of bottom line, and we need the influence from the consumer and also those that are protesting and, you know, working collectively to really kind of challenge the greenwash. I mean, Nina's point was really great. You know, we can't just keep pointing the finger. And yet at the same time, when we do see the greenwashing, we do have that individual and collective responsibility to point it out, to call it out, because it can't just continue to be acceptable. We need to have authentic communication. We need people to really engage with the problems, not just on a surface level appear as if they're engaging with the problems in order to have a social license to operate. And that's absolutely fundamental. And I think that's where we can kind of see individual responsibility and individual actions and influence in order to campaign and support that kind of those bigger contributions, the sort of more systemic and policy driven ones by organizations and governments. So there is a role to play there for the individual, and like Phil said, you know, let's see some big things change from the source of where it can have the biggest influence and open up and create opportunities for, you know, millions and millions of people.
Thank you, Danny. And before we move on to you, Juliet, I'm just going to read a comment so that we're still bringing people in. So Phil, Irene said, really appreciate your position. I think it's really hard to expect the biggest contributors to make the biggest change on a global basis logistically? Example, India as an example, would they not completely struggle with that approach? So more food for thought there coming in for conversations. Over to you, Juliet.
Thank you. I completely agree with what Danny just said. I think that, and I also agree with what Phil was saying earlier, we do need governmental responsibility because that is where the change might stem from. But I do believe that ever since the UNFCCC was created back in 1992, we've always put the blame on governments. Anytime the UN has passed, I don't know, a new treaty or anything, it's always been the responsibility of the governments. There's only one UN document which actually puts the blame on businesses for climate change, and it is not legally binding. It is just a strong series of suggestions on how businesses can be more sustainable. So I think that there is a point when we do need to start not putting the blame, but start putting a bit of responsibility on big businesses, especially since, just as Danny was saying earlier, Exxon, for example, did do extensive studies on climate change back in 1979. They've known about the direct consequences of fossil fuels since 1979. They buried the studies and dismembered, they got rid of the group that was doing the study on climate change, fired all the scientists, and denied the fact that they had those studies up until about 2 years ago. So I think that there does come a point where we do actually need to start putting the blame onto big businesses and actually need to start passing some legislation just to hold them accountable to a certain extent. And we are starting to see that some industries are starting to have to face the consequences of the pollution. So for example, the plastics industry recently with the UK plastic tax that's coming into effect in April 2022, also at the level of the European Union with the EU plastic levy that's come into effect this year. So, but that has only come into effect because of a change in mentality with the people. So people have started doing a bit of plastic bashing in the past, let's say 5 years. And I think that that is a direct link towards all of this plastic legislation that we've seen. It's because the people no longer want plastic, the industry is accepting the fact that they need to implement some changes because they know that people will no longer buy their products unless they're now seen in a positive green light. And so I do think that responsibility is going to come from the public opinion because that does have a strong influence over the profit of companies over everything in general.
Thank you there, Juliet. And we've got time for James for you to add the comment. And then I just want everybody listening to be sitting thinking, where are you with this conversation? Because we're going to invite you into breakout rooms to continue the conversation after this. James.
Yeah, it's well discussed. I think the challenge with big business is you get what you measure, and you know, we've moved to a system where big business has a single metric, which is to maximize shareholder return. So you're maximizing return for people who are privileged enough to have spare money that they can invest in companies in the first place. And at the Coptimism conference, I asked the finance panel, can't you have some part of the return about social value added? And the simple answer was literally, no, it's too difficult to measure. So once you've got big businesses and the people that are invested in those big businesses, either as employees or as expectations as shareholders, it's what we want is the most amount of money. And on a quarter by quarter basis, we want more money this quarter than you got last quarter, and next quarter better be more. And Jack Welch is celebrated for 39 consecutive quarters of growth at G. But at no point in time did anybody say what was the social value, what was the impact on the environment that happened. He was just carried shoulder high. So until you change the metric, you're not going to change the behavior. And I think as well with the largest polluters, if you look at China and you say China is the world's largest polluter, and the answer is, it depends how you measure it. If you look at the way that the 3 scopes of carbon emissions are reported, and you work on the basis that simplistically China is the world's factory, a significant proportion of China's emissions is because we love to consume cheap products that China makes because we can consume more. And I think if you look at and said, okay, there's too much coal in China, they've had to grow economically very, very quickly, and coal was the way to support their power. At one point, China was adding the whole of the UK grid capacity every single year. Then if we take that responsibility to say, actually, if we stop consuming more stuff and forwent that consumption, that would help China lower its carbon emissions. It wouldn't help their economy, but it would help them lower their carbon emissions and incentivize them to move to cleaner power. So I think it is one of those things to look at China and say, you've got to do more, but we're not going to stop consuming. This whole thing about consumption is such a political issue. John Kerry was on the Andrew Marr show a couple of months ago, and he was asked the question, do you think Americans consume too much? And his answer was, I think Americans waste too much. And for me, waste is a function of overconsumption. But to have the notion that the US government thinks that its citizens consume too much, where the American dream is to consume as much as you can afford, that's the link and that's the mindset that has to change, because what you have to have is the mindset that I can consume as much as the planet collectively can sustain us consuming. And that's the biggest single gap that we've got, is we work, we're successful. Success is deemed as the accumulation of personal wealth, and the way that we communicate that wealth to society is through conspicuous consumption. And until we break that link, it's going to be really, really difficult.
Thank you. There's been so much here that I think it would be easy to go off into multiple conversations and continue it on. We're going to open the breakout rooms. You've got 10 minutes. Our panelists will be jumping into rooms, so who knows who you find yourself in conversation with. This is your opportunity to dive in, and then we'll be coming back and we'll just be doing some big group reflections to wrap up before the end of the session. Sarah, are the rooms ready to go? Excellent. And I just want to add you to the spotlight and unmute you, Sarah. I'm also going to remove myself from the spotlight because I think you had made some really interesting points when we were in the last session, and you were talking about your experiences as a climate activist in Pakistan. And I would really just like to give the floor to you, because I'm also very conscious that we've got people from Europe having conversations here. So I really, what's coming up for you?
It's just, it's quite interesting to see, because I think that living in this part of the world for so long now has kind of showed me that the mindset of people is very different and is very climate conscious, whereas living back home, main things for people are shelter, food, and kind of just living, because there's just so much poverty and disparity that the topic of the climate doesn't even cross a lot of people's minds. It's usually people who are from the upper class who are trying to kind of instill these values into people who are living in Pakistan and are living in remote areas. But what I've taken away from it is that it's starting to, at least in my opinion, often become an almost Western ideology, that people are, this concept has come from the West, where other factors are not being taken into consideration, where people have to survive day to day and the climate just isn't in their mind, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think what you're saying is really interesting, because it feeds into this, you know, sustainability is the realm of the privileged middle class. And my family has not always been interested in climate as well. For a bit of a context, you know, some of my family could be considered socially excluded by Western terms, you know, so we're talking like the poor of the poor. And what you've said about what you're noticing in your country really kind of chimes in with what I see with my own family. It's like when you're struggling to put food on the table, when you're worried about if you can pay the bills, when you're worried about whether or not your children are able to actually get what they need in order to thrive, it's really difficult to have time and energy to sit and think, I need to be more considerate and more aware and more respectful of the environment, because actually you're still focused on surviving. And what it's bringing to mind, Sarah, is there's this real link about we need to lift people out of poverty so that we are all able to take care of the environment around us.
Yeah, definitely. And also, more than that, because there's just not enough education for the youth, I think that that's one of the main things that would drive future generations. If even in my case, I didn't learn much about the climate when I was studying in Pakistan, and I went to a private school over there. So, you know, I think that it has to start from the bottom up, and that also includes education. I don't think that I think that Juliet was saying that I don't think that we can rely on governments, because a lot of countries in that part of the world don't even have a stable political climate. So it's really about educating and instilling these values so that growing up, you kind of see that it is our priority and our responsibility to kind of protect the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's coming to mind is there's a really powerful conversation on Wednesday morning with Bremley Lingdo, and he's a friend. I'm so lucky to call him a friend, but he is an indigenous Kazai warrior from Meghalaya in India.
Of course, yeah.
And his dad, I love telling this story. So his dad actually catalyzed a youth movement in the late 60s that led to Meghalaya becoming an independent state within India. And then and I think that was the 70s, you know, so this direct action. And obviously these values have been transmitted from Bremley's father into the work that Bremley does. And, you know, I say to people, it's like, what did you do during lockdown? Because I know that Bremley was in India, in Meghalaya, traveling to help unite 100,000 farmers in some of the most impoverished areas into credit agencies to align this with the SDG goals so that they could actually amplify their income and see that they are not alone, you know, these people who are in some of the worst hit areas of climate change. And, you know, it puts it into perspective when it brings back the conversation that we're having today on whose responsibility is it and what are we capable of, each and every single one of us, when we align with what's important to us.
Definitely. Yeah. It's interesting to see. I mean, I really like hearing the different perspectives people have, especially kind of, I guess the only way I can say it is on this side of the world. It's just that in my head, it's very difficult and unrealistic to replicate these kinds of values back home. And I definitely know that I have had more of a negative mindset on the environment, just because reading the news and everything that's going on in the world, it's definitely depressing. So I personally think that I would have more of a negative mindset on it, which is another thing I'm hoping to change. But yeah. Just went off on a tangent. Yeah.
No, it's not you're bringing it back to the emotional aspect here, which, you know, already in the last conversation, it was a theme that was emerging. And how do we handle these negative emotions? And just as we finish up, I mean, we'll be having a conversation on Thursday with Sammy Aaron from the Resilient Activists as part of our youth track to explore how we help young people handle the emotions of climate change. But I think it's relevant to everybody. I'm just going to wrap our conversation up so that
Yeah.
we can invite people back into the main part. Excellent, you've done that. Thank you so much. We'll just go back into gallery, and I'm just going to remove the spotlight from you. So I think what's great is all of our participants who are watching while being recorded, Zara, get the hidden hints of the conversations that we've been having. And it's also worthwhile to kind of come back and see. Welcoming everybody back into the space just for our final session. Zara and I were having a great conversation. Zara's from Pakistan, so we were just talking about some of the experiences that she's been having, and be able to bring that back. I really stayed and joined and said also moderating. So we'll be pulling out some of these conversations and highlighting it, because there was a lot of powerful points that Zara made that complement the conversations that's already emerging.
Great.
Brilliant.
We're back.
Sorry,
think-
Sandy, I never finished it.
Well, it's just we want to continue the conversation on. So, Sandy, if it's all right, I'd
Hello.
love to come to you first, because you didn't get
Okay.
a chance to speak in the last session. So I'd just like to
Sure.
hear what's coming up for
Oh,
you,
crikey.
what's happening in the conversations.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm approaching my involvement in this in these suites, this suite of webinars and meetings and calls from a business perspective. I work for a consultancy business, and we are in the business of supporting organizations who are interested in making the transition into a well-being economy and applying well-being economy thinking and principles into their organizational culture, their leadership, and their operating environments. So, we're a people development business, and I guess, when it comes down to whose responsibility is it, the fact that certain companies have actually been mentioned and, named, within the oil and gas sector, as a starter for 10, I thought that was an interesting, very apt way to kick things off. But at the same time, as Nina was saying, it's not about the kind of pointing the finger of blame. It's about looking for solutions and looking for actions, things that can actually be put into action, rather than the focus on, the rhetoric and the words. Was the main thrust of what Jimmy and I were talking about.
Perfect. Thanks, Sandy. And I think it's useful for everybody who's watching the recording as well to know that Bonnie will be one of our guest speakers today in the last session at 2:30. So it's the Monday track, number 4, where you'll be able to find out more about the wellbeing economy and understand a bit more. So just to feed that context through there, who would like to share next? I'm coming to Jimmy. I'm also curious if Zara, you'd like to join in the big conversation here just before we return and it becomes the panelists again. So where are we going?
Right.
Ladies first, on you go.
You can go ahead, Mom.
No. Unmute yourself, Zara.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question? As in, where are we going with this?
Well, the question that I have for you is, what do you want to contribute? Because Sarah and I had a really fascinating conversation. For a bit of context, Sarah comes from Pakistan, and we were just talking about differences between Eastern and Western ideologies. So you can continue on some of the conversation that we were having if you want to bring it into the space.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, it's very interesting to see the difference. I mean, living over here, I've lived in the UK now for 5 years, and versus when I go back home, it's just interesting to see how important climate action is in this side of the world versus when I'm back home, where people are mostly focusing on putting food on the table and actually just getting around day by day, and the climate is not something that is very much on their minds. And really, it's more just about, it's almost an upper class concept where people who have had the opportunity to kind of live abroad and experience this kind of awareness, it's become this kind of divide, almost a class divide, really. And it's just interesting to see as well, because it's almost become a Western ideology that people are trying to implement back home, when in reality, obviously it's not that. It's just very difficult when I look at this side of the world and what climate action is being taken and how it can really be implemented back home. Yeah, that's.
Thanks, Sarah. Who wants to comment next?
Could I just add in then? It's
Yes.
fascinating, when Sarah was saying about cultures and, in the various respects. I heard, listening to everybody's contribution earlier, it was very, very much when we were saying the responsibility, and Sandy and I were chatting, it kind of almost the rhetoric almost engenders the blame element. And it's like the sins of the father are being, meted out on us today. And Phil said, that he was blaming old folk like me. But, we used to use glass milk bottles that we recycled, and we used paper bags rather than polythene ones. So, Phil, don't hit me. But, in saying that, I think it's our responsibility, each and every one, no matter where you are on the globe, it's our responsibility to be proactive rather than reactive. And at the moment, everybody's reacting because we believe and we see that there is an issue. But we never reacted when they flooded the rainforest in North Australia, to create a dam. We never reacted when the drug lords burnt down segments of the Amazon, to plant drugs. Or if we did, it was a case of let's go in and blow them up, which destroyed more rainforest. It was just, these are the things that we're not reacting to. And when it comes to cultural elements, and I've got so many dear friends in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, they revere cows across there, but nobody's mentioning the fact that when a cow defecates, the amount of methane that goes into the atmosphere is just as destructive, if not more so, in a lot of cases. I'm not saying let's blame these things. These are facts of life. So what we've got to strive and try and do is be proactive rather than being reactive, rather than look backwards and say, Exxon did this 70 years ago. Okay, they've gone out of business now, so let's blame somebody that brought them over. It wasn't their fault that they brought them over. And it's almost like saying, well, you're buying in, to their sins. It shouldn't be, particularly if they're trying to be, supportive. And I find that is where, we're not doing mediation when we should be. We're building confrontation and blaming folk. And I think it's a shame that, let's bring mediation back into it rather than, the blame culture. Let's address the issues and move forward.
Can I just say, Jim, I think that's exactly right. And I think if you work on the basis that we are where we are, we're the people that are around now when the problem needs to be resolved, and wasting time arguing whether it's fair on us or not is just wasting time that we could be using to solve the problem. And I think if you look back in history, and I'm sure further in history, there'll be some times when the people are faced with bigger challenges. If you were born in 1900, by the age of 50, you'd have been through 2 world wars, a global recession and a global pandemic. That probably didn't seem very fair when you were living through it. So it comes back down to, we are where we are. Let's get this done. And if it's fair or not, well, we can discuss that in the pub when we've solved the problem.
Thank you very much, James, for finishing off our conversation there. I'd just like to say thank you to all of the panelists who've joined us today to bring in your perspectives. They've been really valuable. Thank you for a great conversation. Thank you for the people who have joined in. And we hope to see you on another session, either later today or at some point in the week. Until then, take care, everybody.